Go home, Laura said, apparently drained by the exertion. I don't need you. And you don't need to worry about paying for a funeral, I'm not going to kill myself. Her voice grew even quieter. Not now. Sandra and Frank exchanged a look and gathered their things. Unbelievable, they would rather take this excuse to make an exit than argue. Before they went, Sandra produced a paper bag and handed it to Laura. I bought you this, thought it might help. After they'd gone, Laura pushed the paper bag towards me and I took out a paperback book. It was called Finding Your Happy Place, 21 Practical Ways to Beat Depression and Keep Smiling. I put it in the bin. Do you really want me to go too? I asked softly. She closed her eyes and nodded. I'm sorry, Danny. But I'm so tired. I didn't get much sleep. Okay. I hesitated. I'm so worried about you, Laura. There was a long silence before she said, I'm not going to kill myself. Okay. Please don't. I couldn't bear to live in a world that you're not in. A smile flickered. God, you're so corny. Sometimes.
Are you still going to take
the drugs you were prescribed? She cast her eyes downwards and shook her head. I stood there a moment longer then said, all right. I'll come back later, if that's okay. I've got a meeting with my therapist now anyway. She nodded again, the blankness in her eyes creeping back. You should come with me to see her. She said it would help us. Especially. Single quote. Especially now, I was going to say. Now that you've tried to commit suicide. It wouldn't be like the therapist you saw when you were a kid, I promise. I'm fine, she said. I'm feeling a lot better. I'll see you later, okay. I took the bus to Crouch End, sitting on the top deck. I could still feel the alcohol sloshing about in my system, and maybe it was this trace of drunkenness that made me feel a spark of optimism. Laura had called me Danny. She hadn't called me Danny since we'd split up. Maybe, I thought, her brush with death would make her decide we were better together. That she needed me. If she came back to me, if we were united again, I was convinced we would be able to recover from our experiences and fight anything else the world threw at us. We were 100 times stronger together. In the days and weeks following our return to England, when everything at home had seemed so dismal, the two of us trapped in our own dark spaces inside our heads, barely communicating, I had lost sight of that. Laura had taken it further. She said that looking at me reminded her of what had happened, that every time she saw my face she was jolted back in time. She could never hope to recover when she saw me every day. But do you still love me? I had asked, in one of the final days before she left. There had been a long silence. Do you still love me? She looked at me searchingly and maybe I took a moment too long to say, of course. Always. I should have done everything I could to make her stay, to make it work. I should have convinced her that we were better together, that we could get through it if we were united. Instead, I had watched her walk out the door, barely protesting. Now I allowed myself to hope, and as the bus rattled along the streets I tried to work out how best to play it. I decided I needed to give her time and space. I mustn't pressure her. But if I could persuade her to come and see Dr. Savage, either with me or on her own. I resolved to talk to Aaron about it. Perhaps Laura would finally listen to her, now that Aaron had saved her life. Dr. Savage's house was a few streets from the bus stop. The brightness had faded and the sky above the terraced houses was colorless, like a picture in which the artist had forgotten to paint the sky. A child on a micro-scooter almost collided with me as I turned the corner onto Dr. Savage's street, making my heart jump. As I approached her house, which was halfway along, it gradually dawned on me that something was wrong. At first, I thought the house looked a little strange, darker than usual, with someone in a yellow coat standing outside. As I got closer, my mouth fell open. A dark gray blemish stretched across the facade of the house from the top windows, which had been boarded up, down to the front door. The windows on the ground floor were cracked and coated with some kind of black substance. A broken chair lay in the front garden and tiles had fallen from the roof. Yellow tape was strung around the whole house. The person in the yellow coat was a police officer, standing guard in a waterproof jacket. He looked up as I approached. What happened? Can I ask who you are, sir? I'm one of Claudia Sauvage's patients. I have an appointment now. The policeman, who was younger than me and looked cold and miserable, said, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but there was a fire here yesterday. He cleared his throat. Oh my God. I forced out the words. What caused it? The policeman looked up and down the street. I'm very sorry, sir, but I can't discuss that. Terrible business. I whirled round. An elderly man had strolled across the road and stood looking up at the house, shaking his head. I live across the street, he said. Can't believe it, the poor couple. They'll be missed dreadfully. It took a moment for this to register. Missed, I said quietly. The old man stared up at the burnt-out house. Yes, both the Sauvages are dead. They were trapped upstairs. Nothing the fire brigade could do. He walked away, muttering, terrible business. Terrible. Chapter 24. I stopped off at my flat, grabbed my laptop and went out. I didn't want to be on my own at home. I needed to be around people, around the living. There was a coffee shop at the end of the road that also served greasy all-day breakfasts. Just what my body craved. The first item on my list was to look up more information about what had happened to Dr. Sauvage and her husband. My relationship with my therapist had been purely professional, but that didn't make her death any less shocking. She was only in her 40s. And what a horrific and terrifying way to die. I wondered if her dogs, those snuffling pugs, had perished too. The story was on the Evening Standard website, with a photo of the burnt-out house plus a snapshot of the smiling Sauvages, Claudia and Patrick, taken a few years ago. They had no children, which was something. There was no mention of the dogs. Then I read the line at the end of the article. Police are trying to ascertain whether the Sauvages were victims of arson and are expected to release more information in the coming days. Arson. My God. Why would someone do that? I wondered if Dr. Sauvage had made enemies. It was truly dreadful. And, feeling guilty for the selfish thought, I wondered who I was going to talk to now. Laura was too fragile and my therapist was gone. That only left one candidate, my best friend. Jake and I arranged to meet the next day at friend's house, the Quaker place on Euston Road. He had a meeting at the offices of a record company who were based in a glittering new office block beside the station. This is it, he told me on the phone. I'm pretty certain. They're going to offer me a deal. That's amazing. As soon as he gave me this news I almost cancelled. He was so excited and I didn't want to bring him down. But I suspected that the moment he agreed to the deal he would go into orbit for a while. It was best to talk to him now while he was still within Earth's gravitational field. My CCTV equipment had arrived at lunchtime and I'd spent the early afternoon setting it up. The camera was positioned above the entrance to the front door of the flat. It was connected to an app on my phone and was triggered by movement. If anyone entered the flat, the camera would start recording. As I left the flat, I looked up at the camera and smiled. Friend's house is the Quakers' London base, with a cafe and meeting area that is open to the public. It was one of Jake's favorite places to meet because of the relaxed vibe. I arrived first, bought a coffee and carrot cake and took them to the back of the meeting area, where it was quiet and secluded. A few brave souls shivered outside in the courtyard, where a light dusting of snow that had fallen during the afternoon coated the tables and gathered on window sills. While I waited, I texted Laura and asked how she was. I hesitated, then sent another message before she replied, telling her I was going to talk to Jake about what happened. My therapist is dead, I typed. And I need to talk to someone. I hope you understand X. Jake arrived wrapped in a chunky military-style coat, a long scarf wrapped around his neck. I had been right about him being ready for liftoff. Energy radiated off him as if he was a human microwave. He could barely keep still. He grabbed a large coffee and chatted up the Quaker girl at the counter. Got her number, he grinned when he got back to the table. He sat down, his leg jerking back and forth, the worst case of restless leg syndrome I'd ever seen. Hey, who was that Eastern European girl you were with the other night? She was well rude. Hot though. Don't tell me you pulled her. She wasn't that rude to you. He waved a hand. Sorry, I'm turning into an egomaniac, aren't I? I need you to tell me when I'm acting like a wanker, Dan. Keep you grounded, you mean? Down here where the mortals live. Hey, you're a supersonic business dude. Apps sell a lot more than music these days. It should be me keeping you grounded. Instead, you're still acting like the world is a funeral procession. Even though you're pulling hot women like that. Where was she from? Romania, I said. He slapped the table. Really? So is she your new girlfriend? Have you given up on Laura? That would break my heart. I'm still convinced the two of you are going to get back together at any moment. Remember, you promised I could be your best man. I've already got some great jokes lined up. I sipped my coffee. It had gone cold. I was tempted to ask Jake to hold the mug, thinking that the heat coming off him would make it drinkable again. No, she's not my girlfriend. But Romania. Well, that's what I want to talk to you about. He sat forward. Surely you're not finally going to tell me what went down with you and Laura in Europe. I don't know. But I want to tell you about everything. That's happened since. His phone rang. Sorry, he said. Got to answer this. He wandered out into the frosty courtyard and I watched him talking animatedly. I was envious of him. Everything was going brilliantly, nothing tainted, no shadows clawing at the edges of his life. This moment, about to sign a record deal, with everything ahead of him, the promise of greatness, was probably as good as it would ever get. As he had said, I should be feeling like that too, had indeed felt like it when Laura and I set off on our trip. I wished I was back in that place, the magical garden where Jake stood now. Seeing him striding about the courtyard, chatting away, a big smile on his handsome face, I realized that I couldn't be envious of him. He'd worked so hard for this. I was proud of him. He came back inside, his hair glistening with snowflakes. That was my manager. Universal and Sony want to meet me now too. So that's 3 of the big 4. He rubbed his hands together. You deserve it, I said. Thanks, man. Though I haven't signed anything yet. You will. You're going to be a star. Soon the only glimpse of you I'll get will be when you're in the paper, hanging out with Taylor Swift and Rihanna. I think I'd prefer Beyoncé. Anyway, you're gonna be a big techie superstar. We'll be going to the same parties. We'll be. Shit, Dan, your face. You look like I just reminded you that you've got cancer or something. I'm sorry. You have my undivided attention. Thanks. Come on, then. Hit me with it. What's going on? So I told him about the burglar returning my stuff and the fraudulent use of my debit card. I told him how my therapist's house had burned down, leaving me halfway through my course of treatment with no one to talk to. I filled him in on the details of Laura's suicide attempt, which made his mouth drop open, and how she'd apparently been seeing ghosts again. I'm sure I saw someone watching her too. And someone might have tried to push her under a tube train. All this weird shit. Fucking hell, he said when I'd finished. Have you been to the police? They think I either hallucinated the break-in, that I'm crazy, or that I'm a liar and a time waster. Sometimes I think I am going crazy. Single quote. I trailed off. I decided not to tell him about hallucinating the photos from the train. It's ever since Romania. I looked at him, my eyes stinging. He didn't say anything for a few moments, just stared at me. And are you going to tell me what happened? I want to. I really need to talk to someone. That's what I intended to do. But now, when it comes to it. Single quote. Daniel. It's me. You can talk to me about anything. I'm not going to go and blab to anyone about it. I promise. I know you think I'm a major gossip, but I swear, hand on heart, I won't tell. Whatever it is. I tore an empty sugar sachet to shreds, unable to meet his eye. It's so hard to talk about. Just getting the words out. Plus I'm afraid of burdening you with it. Burdening me. Come on. It can't be that bad. I looked up him. But it is. I started by telling him about the train journey, meeting Alina and Ion, the guards throwing us off the creepy station in the middle of nowhere. He listened, enwrapped, as I told him about the walk along the tracks, Alina going into the forest and disappearing. Laura and I going to look for her. And then we found a house. In the middle of the forest. He stared at me, eyes wide, as I told him what happened next. Chapter 25. As we moved closer to the house, I could see gray shadows flickering in the upstairs windows, those jack-o'-lantern lights. Candles. Somebody was home. There was a little boy inside me yelling at my adult self as we approached the place. This is a witch's house, a witch who lures and eats the lost, who'll fatten you and devour you, make bread from your bones. Run. Run as fast and far as you can, find a bed, get under the covers and hide there. Laura touched my hand. Daniel. Look. Laura was pointing at something and at first I thought my heart had leapt from my body and was lying there, twitching in the dead grass, but I somehow got hold of myself, forced my eyes to focus. Alina's other boot. I stooped and picked it up, turned back to Laura, cradling the boot like it was a kitten. We should go, get help, I said. My girlfriend set her jaw and, not answering me, walked up the path towards the house. I wavered. What was I, a boy or a man? Perhaps if I'd been here on my own I would have run, gone to seek help. But the need to stay with Laura, to not look like a coward, was even stronger. The door was solid, fashioned from the oak trees that surrounded the house. I could sense those trees behind us, like they were watching, daring us to go inside. All the hair on the back of my neck stood to attention, ripples ran the length of my spine. Why was this house here, deep in the forest? I guessed it must have been the home of what? A huntsman. A woodcutter. Some kind of ranger. A witch. The house had an ancient air about it, centuries old. It probably predated the railway line we had walked along. The door had no number, no letterbox. I suppressed a hysterical giggle at the thought of a postman traipsing through the forest to deliver junk mail and flyers from pizza places. Laura raised a fist to knock, but I caught her wrist. I somehow knew, as if I'd seen it in a dream, that the door would open if I pushed it. It did. It was stiff, heavy, but it swung open slowly, revealing a large open space. I stepped inside, Laura following, holding onto my shirt. The room reminded me of the entrance hall of a stately home. It was dark, lit only by the moonlight that penetrated from outside. No candles here. I waited for my eyes to adjust and soon saw that the darkness concealed very little. A couple of chests, a coat stand with a black jacket hanging from it. Doors stood closed in both corners and, directly in front of us, a stairway stretched up into more darkness. Laura and I looked at each other. She looked more afraid now we were inside the house. If I had sensed a sickness about this place before we came inside, I felt it more keenly now. Terrible things had happened here. I knew that as clearly as I knew my own name. Laura had taken a few steps into the room but now moved back towards the exit, like she'd had second thoughts. Maybe it was the smell that did it. The room had a musty, damp odor, the cloying reek of mildew and rot. But there was another smell, a top note, that was worse. Years ago I had lived in a bedsit that had a vile stink. Eventually I found the source. The previous tenant had left glue traps beneath the cooker and the fridge, and dead rats had been left rotting for weeks. That's what this place smelled like. Rotting flesh. Death. You want to go? I whispered to Laura. She stared at me, the fear evident in her eyes now. A look that said this was a mistake. A look that asked what the fuck we were doing here. The door had drifted shut behind us and I had a horrible feeling that it was locked now, that we were trapped. That we would be trapped here forever. Maybe we would have gone then, done what we should have in the first place, gone back through the trees, kept going along the railway tracks, sought help in town. But then we heard the noise. Jake's mobile rang, jerking me back to the present moment. Fuck, sorry, he said. It's the guy from the record company. He clearly felt anxious about answering the call. It's all right. Take it. I'm sorry, man. I'll be right back. He stood up and walked away, saying, and right, as he went. I had torn a dozen more sugar sachets to shreds while talking, and now I picked at the pieces. Grains of white sugar were scattered across the tabletop. I felt sick, wondering if I'd have the guts to tell Jake the rest of the story. If I would be able to tell him the truth about what had happened. He reappeared at the table. He wore a sheepish expression. Daniel, man, I'm really sorry. They've moved the meeting forward so the executive VP of A&R can sit in. Seeing my blank expression, he added, he's like the top dog. You have to go. Daniel, I really want to hear the rest of what happened. Why don't we have a drink later? After my meeting. Okay. Maybe. He bounced from foot to foot, agitated. Go on, I said, forcing a smile. I'll call you later. Knock him dead. Thanks, Dan. He ran around the corner. I heard him bump into someone and apologize. Then he was gone. By the time I got back to my street, the sky was dark and starless and the snow had given way to icy rain. Cold drops ran down the back of my neck as I entered my building and ran a hand through my hair. There was a new poster on the wall, the words printed by a trembling hand. To whoever put their food waste in the green bin, this bin is for recycling only. This was followed by a threat to report this irresponsible person to the residents' association. I rolled my eyes. I was surprised there was no mention of the pizza-munching fox. I trotted up the stairs and put my key in the lock, keen to get into the sanctuary of my flat despite the recent intrusions. I felt jittery and uneasy in my skin and had already decided that I didn't have the mental energy to meet up with Jake after his meeting and tell him the rest of the story. Another day. I flicked on the light. Nothing happened. The light in the communal hallway behind me was working, so it couldn't be a power cut. I left the heavy door propped open with my bag, which was just sturdy enough to hold it, and went into the kitchen to test the light there, flicking the switch. Again, nothing happened. The flat was in darkness. The fuse box was in a cupboard beneath the kitchen worktop. On the rare occasions when the power had gone out before, in fact, I could only remember it happening once, I had simply needed to push the fuse switch back down. Kneeling on the floor, trying to see the fuse box in the nearly non-existent light, I heard the front door shut, plunging me into complete darkness. Fuck, the bag must have been too light to hold the door for long. But I was able to feel the fuse switches now, running my finger along to find out which one had tripped. None of them had. I took my phone out of my pocket and used it as a torch to double check. No, the fuse switches were all in position. Without removing the fuse cartridges, I couldn't see if the fuse wires were intact, and I couldn't remember whether the switch would trip if the fuse blew. In normal circumstances, none of this would have made me feel nervous, but recent events made me wonder. Had somebody been in here again? Had they disabled the lights? Were they still here, hiding? I went back to the front door, feeling my way along the wall, stumbling over the vacuum cleaner and almost falling. I looked up at the CCTV camera above the door, wondering if it had captured anyone. Maybe someone had spotted it and turned the lights out so they could move about without being filmed. I fumbled for my phone so I could check the app that was connected to the camera, and promptly dropped it. It bounced and skidded under the furniture. I hesitated. My fear that someone was in the flat now overrode my desire to find the phone, so I went back out into the communal hallway. The light, which switched itself off after a short while, had gone out now. I turned it back on and stood in the hallway trying to decide what to do. I could knock on one of my neighbors' doors, ask them if they had a torch. I looked at my nearest neighbor's door. I never spoke to the woman who lived here, suspected that she was responsible for the crazy signs that were always appearing. I didn't want to get her involved, especially as the likelihood was that this was a failed fuse. I made a decision: I would go back in, recover my phone, and check the app to see if someone had been in the flat. I went back inside and, this time, used the vacuum cleaner to prop the door open. I got down on all fours and felt under the sofa and the coffee table, feeling for my phone. Where the hell was it? I swore out loud and thumped the floor with my fist. A scrabbling sound came from the bedroom. I jerked upright. There was someone in my bedroom. Oh Jesus, I needed my phone. I needed to call the police. But then came another bang, then another. I jumped to my feet, headed to the front door, then thought no. This was my chance to find out who had burgled my flat, to catch them and get some answers out of them myself. The police would probably take forever to get here. And I was pissed off. Sick of my world being violated. I crept into the kitchen and took a large knife from the block on the worktop. Then, trembling with fear and fury, I tiptoed to the bedroom door and, holding the knife aloft with my right hand, used the left to quickly push the door open. For a moment, I could see nothing. And then something hit me, knocking the breath from my body as I fell to the floor, forcing the knife from my grasp. It spun away across the carpet. Chapter 26. I was pinned to the floor on my back, foul, meaty breath in my face. A growl came from deep inside my attacker's body and I pushed as hard as I could, but my attacker was on top of me, a blur in the darkness. Teeth and saliva and wet lips grazed my throat and, as adrenaline surged into my system, I found strength I didn't know I had, shoving and twisting onto my side. A second later and the black dog that had leapt out of the darkness, would have torn out my throat. As soon as I twisted onto my side I saw the knife, just within reach. I grabbed it and swung it at the dog, which wriggled away as I tried to slash it. Instead, the blade nicked the side of its nose, and it let out a whimper of pain. As quickly as it had leapt onto me, it bounded away. I was free. It shot out through the front door, growling and barking, as I pushed myself up, coughing and feeling my neck. Just stinking saliva, no blood. If I hadn't been able to twist away, if I hadn't been carrying the knife. I didn't want to think about it. The dog had a Rottweiler's face but was completely black and the size of a pit bull. A dog bred to guard, to fight. To kill. I staggered to my feet and went out into the hallway. The dog had run down the stairs and was dashing to and fro in the lower hallway, frantic, thumping into the door, bouncing off the walls. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking over the handrail so I had a full view of the hallway, coiled and ready to rush back into my flat if the animal showed any sign of coming back up the stairs. At that moment, the door of my downstairs neighbor opened and she appeared in the doorway. She was in her 30s, frizzy hair, glasses, wearing a thick pink jumper. She pointed a finger at me. "Hey, you're not allowed dogs in this building." The dog leapt towards her. She screamed and slammed the door shut with surprising reaction speed. The animal hit the wood mid-jump, crashed and fell to the floor, stunned for a moment before getting back on its feet. It turned to look up at me, bearing 2 rows of teeth like knives. I dashed back into my flat, shutting the door, plunged into darkness again. Once more, I crawled across the living room floor, and my hand made contact almost immediately with my phone. I said a silent prayer and hit 999, listening as the dog rushed around downstairs, emitting a series of harsh, low barks. The police came and summoned a dog warden, who captured the animal using a loop on a stick and dragged it into the back of his van. After he'd taken it away, the young police officer helped me examine the fuse box, finding that 2 of the fuse wires needed replacing. Fortunately, one of the neighbors, most of whom had come out to see what was going on, had some spares, so my lights were soon working again. "Bad luck for 2 to blow at once," the officer said. His name was Sadler. "So, sir, what happened?" I hesitated. On impulse, perhaps because I didn't want him to start looking at me in the way PC Sergeant had, I said, I don't know. It must have followed me and when I got home, snuck in through the door behind me. When I found the lights weren't working, I left my flat door open and it came in and attacked me. He tutted. Lots of strays around here. Most of them come from the estate. He shook his head at the state of the city he policed. Do you need a doctor? No, I'm fine. It didn't bite me. I'm just a bit shocked. Understandable, sir. He smiled. You don't have any sausages in your bag, do you? I had temporarily lost my sense of humor. He said goodbye and went off to take a statement from the woman. Downstairs. After taking a moment to gather myself, I stood up, my legs unsteady, and went into the bedroom. It looked like a tornado had ripped through it. The bedside lamp lay broken on the floor, along with books, papers and framed photographs of Laura and me. The bedding was trampled and one pillow had been chewed, pieces of foam scattered around. I wondered why I hadn't heard it as soon as I came in and guessed it must have fallen asleep after destroying my room and been awakened by the sound of my punching the floor. There was a terrible stench in the air, the source of which I found quickly, a huge turd curled on the little rug in front of the chest of drawers. I rolled the rug up and stuffed it into a black bin liner, taking it and dumping it in the bin outside. I sensed a presence nearby and looked up to see the scavenging fox standing nearby. It turned and slunk away, tail dragging on the pavement.